right. So I think this should record now. Wonderful. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the KUDO community meeting on April 18th. I'm Fabian Baier, I'm the host of this meeting, and we have a quick, short agenda. We talk real quick about all open caps, in particular dynamic-crds, and then we talk about more questions and some other open PRs and maybe some more issues. We just have 4 people here in the call. We have Denis and we have Gaston. If you haven't introduced yourself yet, is everyone maybe so kind and introduce themselves for a minute? I start real quick. So I'm a software engineer here at Mesosphere working on KUDO.
So Denis, sales engineer, working in EMEA at Mesosphere.
I'm Gaston. I'm also a software engineer at Mesosphere, and I've been working mostly on Mesos stuff, but looking to start working on KUDO.
Wonderful.
And I'm Tom Runyon, Kubernetes consultant working on KUDO.
Okay, and Tom, if you want, can you talk real quick about dynamic-crds? And I think that's the next point here. If you want, I can also stop sharing and you share your screen.
Yeah, I'll share my screen if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So this link is in the community notes. The progress that we've made over the last week is to actually go and try and implement what the CRDs would look like for a framework. And we chose MySQL as a baseline. And this document has a section here, sample frameworks, that actually goes through and looks at all the objects that would get created. I'll walk through those briefly. And then there's one thing that we found when looking at other frameworks that we have to figure out how to solve. So in this dynamic CRD model, you have a KUDO object called framework. And by creating an instance of this framework object, the KUDO controller would create a CRD of type mysql.kudo kind version. And by creating a version, you identify a particular framework version that you want to populate a definition of. So until you create a MySQL framework object, you can't create a version object in this API group. Now creating a version now creates a bunch of other CRDs that we can now start creating. There's these shadow objects, which have the same spec as a true core v1 service, but they're specific to MySQL. This allows us to have the same name for a service in multiple frameworks, which was an issue that we had with the current CRD setup, where you could have a V1 of MySQL and a V1 of Kafka, but you couldn't call them both V1 because there'd be a naming collision on that version object. So a similar situation, different framework versions, frameworks might have a service object of the same name, and we want to be able to uniquely identify and separate those and give a framework developer the freedom to have a name of their choosing. So these server objects just shadow the core v1. So typical spec, this persistent volume claim, same concept, mirrors, shadows the core v1. And we have the backup claim for storing backups of MySQL when you run the backup and restore.
So if I, like, one quick question for the service thing, if I got that right. So the service name, in this case here, MySQL, if you would actually like list all of the services in your cluster, you would see the name just MySQL, or would it have kind of like the MySQL service MySQL kind of names, or how would it look like?
Yeah, that is a good question. So this service object actually isn't a service itself. It is an input value to rendering an instance of MySQL. So when you render a MySQL instance by creating an instantiation of mysql.kudo.k8, that's when you actually compile, render this service object into an actual core v1 service. And customize does some configuration of this service to make it unique for that instance. And that's where you would get that prefix that you talked about.
Exactly. Okay.
Instance name would be a prefix of this service.
I see. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's almost a template, if you kind of want to think about it like that. And then it gets rendered at runtime, at instantiation time. Similar with all of these names that you'll see here and down below. The interesting portions are the stuff with pods, as always. So we create a deployment object. This spec would actually render a true deployment as it currently stands if you were to just change the type to core v1 or apps v1, sorry. So we want to make sure that this is a coherent object so that if someone looks on this, they see by default what is actually going to be deployed. So it's got environment variables that we'll see later get modified by parameters, but for now, have a default value in there that gets set and is usable. It has the volume claim that matches the claim from above. Yeah. That's all I kind of want to say about that. And then it's got this base job that by default is used for the init step that creates a table, create table example inside of the database KUDO. So this init job we'll see later actually gets run after the deployment gets created and is healthy.
Yeah, just a quick question about the version. So you create a version at the beginning.
Yes.
And how do you link the rest to this version? So this framework version is v1, and then when you create objects below, do they belong to this v1 because of the /v1 at the end? Because it's a little bit confusing because you see you have also this API version v1 and when you create the version itself. So
you're right. It's not clear that that's the mapping, and I should have done a better job and maybe called this latest or alpha or something more unique than v1. But in my mind, this v1 is this implies
okay.
or
so if I ask differently, if it would be alpha, then the API version, when you create the version framework, would be v1 still?
The framework is a KUDO object, so that's not going to get changed.
No. I mean the version. When you say you see the API version of the framework version object. This one.
So this v1 is chosen randomly. This doesn't have any implications on anything else down the line.
Okay.
You have to pick an API version for these objects, and it's confusing that this is v1 as well.
Yeah, so perhaps if you document it perhaps with a different name, or I don't know, because otherwise I think it will be confusing to understand the relationship.
That's good feedback. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you agree with me that if you create a v2 later, you will still use API version v1 at the top?
Yes. So if you wanted a multiple versions here, you'd have different names, but these top 3 lines would look the same.
Yeah. Okay. So perhaps you could just like put it version 1 completely, or like if it's MySQL, you can just use the version of MySQL. I think it would be less confusing. You say like you call it like v 3.5. So,
can't have periods.
Sorry? You cannot get periods?
Yeah.
You cannot get periods, so you have to use like a dash or something like that.
Right. So that's one of the unfortunate things trying to get like semver implemented. Can't actually use periods there, so it's one of the frustrations we saw.
And then another quick quick feedback also, if you look at the way the SDK is built on DCOS packages, for example. Generally, the versions are always kind of the version of a framework dash the version of the software, and it's really useful. Like you can have like it's the version 1.0 of this framework, but this is the version 3.5 of MySQL or whatever. So then it will be 1.0 dash 3.5. So if we say to people, okay, let's use dash because we cannot use dot, then we should propose like a, I don't know, naming convention, like I don't know, what else can we use apart from dash, like underscore, something like that?
That'd be like a host name.
It cannot be underscore as well, right?
Well, we will discuss a lot of this in the issue number, I think, 163, enhancement request versioning scheme, where we actually talk about how do we, what is the scheme that we follow, and what you mentioned was now the implementation version and then the base technology version and so forth. So that have a look at 163, and also like if you have more thoughts, comment on it. That would be valuable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there's a couple versions we're trying to.
And it was already considering the fact that CRD will have an impact on that, or it was before the CRDs, or the dynamic CRDs? I mean.
It's kind of related to the CRD conversation.
Yeah.
Because the version for the API, we've had several thoughts. One that DCOS does. There's a framework version. There's an application version. I think of things as like the framework version is the infrastructure setup. And if you change how the infrastructure is set up, then you should have a new framework version. Although you can run many different application versions inside of one infrastructure configuration, potentially, depending on the application. Jared's more of the line that the user is the person that the API version should be consistent for. So if you have a new set of parameters or a new way that you're instantiating a MySQL instance, then you want to change the framework version, even if your infrastructure is all the same, all slightly different behind the scenes. It's from the application operator's perspective that the API should be consistent. Other people have mentioned maybe it should be application version specific. So if you go from 5.7 to 5.8 in MySQL, you need a new framework version. There's a lot.
Yeah, I took a look at quickly at the issue, and it was already like an open question. So I think it's something that still need to be.
Yeah, we'd love your feedback though.
And it's not yet a cap; it's a request for a cap, if you will. So
yeah.
So this is our current proposal, but it doesn't necessarily go into when should I change a framework version. So I kind of wanted to back away from that question because that's a great question, but it's worthy of a huge discussion on its own. Okay, so we talked about the job and the deployment. Patches. So in Customize, you have this idea of an object either being an object itself, a base as they call it, or a patch. And the patch gets applied onto the base and modifies just the values that are set. So here, the spec looks very strange because I have an extra layer of patch spec, because I want to apply this spec to some base job. And then I want to add this volume and this volume mount inside of a container with that name. I didn't like that there's this extra patch here, and then we'll see later that I specifically say use the job called volumes as a patch. So I thought there was a lot of duplicate configuration there. But if you just have it as the raw spec, template spec, then it's confusing as to whether this is a true job that could get run as is, a base, or whether it's a patch base, because you really shouldn't be using this as a base. You should only be using this as a patch.
So yeah, there are like 3 specs within 6 lines or so, right? But the first spec is the requirement anyways of the CRD, and we cannot make it on a higher level a patch name, right? That's just not possible.
You could have a job patch object.
Yeah. What was the reasoning behind doing it this way and not like having your own patch object?
CRD creep. We already have a lot of CRDs.
Yeah.
Jared was concerned about having too many, and I think the Kubernetes team has said that they're not expecting hundreds and hundreds of CRDs. They're expecting tens. Now, if we're already doing hundreds, what's a couple extra? I don't know. We haven't really stretched that limit yet.
It's also like the namespace patch has been taken. by this specific one. If it's a more general way, maybe other people use it in total different other ways.
Right. Or maybe this is a job patch, and then you've got a deployment patch and a service patch. And
Yeah.
then you not only have.
And what about a type patch? And then you add another parameter to say what kind of patch, if it's a patch for a job or a patch for,
Right. So that could be nice if we had a nice dynamic representation of what the spec looks like for a patch. Here, it was very clear that I know what this spec looks like from Go because this job spec is already an object in Core V1 Kubernetes. So we could use this very nicely inside of KUDO. If now this is a dynamic patch object, this patch spec is different depending upon which job type it is, and trying to coordinate that reflection isn't always as easy as you'd like.
Okay, but having the patch spec is not so bad. I mean, it's fine. Okay. Nobody will spend his life reading these YAML codes to see if they are fancy or not,
Right. So yeah, I'd love feedback in here so that we can continue this conversation. That's good. So this one added volumes to the job. This one actually does the backup and restore. So it changes the command that gets run. So when we build our backup job, we'll first patch to add the backup volume, and then we'll change the command to run backup. And for the restore job, we'll add the volume, and then we'll change the command to run the restore command. So we were able to take that base job and start modifying it nicely based on these three other objects. And we'll see that in a minute. All right, so now we want to recreate those task objects, task steps, phases, plans in these action CRDs that we have. So in this action set, we deploy all of these objects in parallel because we didn't specify a strategy. So it does MySQL, backup PV, MySQL PV, and MySQL deployment. Deploys all of those. That's called deploy objects. And then the deploy plan, which is the one that gets called when you create your instance by default, has a serial deployment of these two actions. One is the deploy object action, which was defined here. And the second is actually a job object, a MySQL job object, which is runnable in our interface talk up above. So you could think of this as a step with a single task, which has a single object in it. And you can compose them in a easy way here. So now we didn't need to make a task, a step, a phase, and then a plan. We just have this action object that kind of represents all of those, and you can nest those accordingly if you want to have some cascade and some complex hierarchy. You can do 1 level deep, you can do 8 levels deep, so it gives you that flexibility, and it doesn't require you to have exactly 4 levels every time, even if you're only having one thing in each of the 4 levels.
And the deploy object is the one that you created just before, right?
Yep, so this deploy object, the first one in that list is just this action object here.
And can you show me the job again?
Yep, so we had the job, and that is this job object here.
And what is it supposed to do?
It so logs in with the username and password, and then it creates a table called example.
Okay. Would you mind calling it init?
Sure.
Because otherwise it's very confusing, because.
So it's init by default, but once you start modifying these patches, it does other things. But you're right. It is a job that initializes the database with some sample table. So that would be good.
And I'm trying to find that hackmd document, but
it's in your community notes.
Oh, yeah, the one in the community notes, is that the one that we have here?
Yep, that one right there.
It's it's different to me. So, maybe. Oh, there we go.
That was the deploy plan. I think it was easier to build than what we had to do in the previous version because we needed to make those objects into tasks, and then we needed to have this plan that was 4 levels deep, even though we really only wanted a single level on this node and 2 levels on this node because this node is made up of those 4 objects. So I kind of think about it as a pyramid. So we can make other plans, actions, backup. All right, let's take our base job, and then we'll apply some patches to it. We want to add the volumes as we talked about. So we apply that as a patch strategic merge, and we wanted to change the command to do the backup. So we did that with that patch strategic merge. So now this is our entire backup plan. Similarly, restore, which I did not rename. Restore, that says restore right there. Don't worry about it. Has a comparable thing. Start with your job, add your volumes, but instead of changing the command to do backups, we change it to do restores. So this goes back to the patch syntax from this object here. We specify it as a patch here, and in the restore job, we also specify that it's a patch there. So I didn't really like that duplicated definition because as a framework developer, I would constantly forget to do one of the two, or I would use one in the wrong place. So I'd rather it be in one place so that you can just focus on that's where I need to specify it and not have multiple places. Yeah, so that's the base job. That's the base MySQL instance. Now, what this doesn't cover is how to customize it for my particular instance. And the idea here is that this set of objects above that we've talked about is coherent and works as is. And then if you want to add customizations, you can do that by adding parameters. And this kind of came about when Jorg was looking at this job, maybe the Flink job, and suggested, hey, maybe you should have the PV that stores backups of Flink be customizable. And I said, you're right, someone might want that, but I don't want to do that right now. So this gives the ability for an application operator or cluster admin to add parameters to the framework version up and on top of the ones that come with the framework version by default. So we could have this open source MySQL framework version, and it works as is, but some operators want to expand that and add other customizations and parameters. So to do that, for instance here, now you can customize the MySQL root password. So the password object parameter, it's got a name, it's got a default value, description, display name. These are really good for like if you wanted to add some tooling for a UI to kind of fill out what those are. Validation, I don't know how we want to do validation, but I think that should be in there. This might go very well if we had multiple application versions in one framework version. So let's say our framework version could support MySQL 5.4 to 5.7, but not 5.8. It'd be great to add a parameter for the image tag and then be able to specify what values are allowed or not. So that's something we need to figure out long term. This is kind of design, nice to have right now. I don't know that we need it right away. Trigger, so when I update this on an instance, what do I need to run? And right now I just tell it to redeploy again. And maybe that's not right. Maybe what I actually want to do is just deploy objects, which is probably what I want to do. I don't actually want to do a deploy because I don't want to rerun that init. I want to run deploy objects. So this gives you the flexibility to run any plan you want or build your own plan before you make this parameter and then run that one. So it kind of gives you that flexibility to do whatever. This password variable is then used in the customize down below. But then you need to specify kind of your patches. So what is this parameter changing in my objects? Well, it's going to change two things. One is the deployment, so that when MySQL starts up, it knows what the MySQL root password is. And then the other one is it's going to change the job that actually goes in and does backups and restores and inits. So this gives you the flexibility or the ability to specify how changing this value gets applied on any object in your framework version.
And why it's not just like changing the environment variable? I would say like if you have an environment variable in your original object, then you would expect that it's just change the variable and that's it, no?
It did, and that's what this specifies, and that's why I kind of paused there, because it's not super clear that that's what it's doing, but this patch looks for, in this MySQL object, a container with the name MySQL, and then sets the environment variable MySQL root password to be that password. And likewise on the job, it looks for a container named MySQL and changes the environment variable to be password.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if let's say if in the original deployment, you say you have a variable that is called MySQL password, for example, and you put the value that by default you want to use, like you see this MySQL root password,
right,
and you
right
have a
there.
value that is password. So that would be easier that if in the kind parameter, I can just say I want another value for MySQL root password, and automatically that means that in all of these different objects, that will now use the one in the parameter and not the one that you have specified here.
So would you have to change this deployment object to capture that functionality?
No, you would keep the same deployment object like you said here, and you have a value that is like you say, environment is MySQL password is password, because this is the default value you have in your deployment. But when you go in the parameter side, I would expect that if the name of the parameter is MySQL value, then automatically this is overriding the default value in this environment variable. I imagine that in the name of the parameter, you can perhaps not use it the same way because you don't want to have like uppercase and underscore and so on. But let's say if the type of the parameter is environment variable, then I just want to override. It will be a lot easier than having to redescribe again your objects, you know.
I see. So you'd have different parameter types, and one example is an environment variable, and you could specify just key value, namely what key should it be, and then this parameter is that corresponding value. And then any pod that gets created in that framework version gets that environment variable injected.
Yeah. I think it would be easier, because otherwise, like you said before, you will have the duplication of code, because you will have to rewrite your spec again and again, you know, in many places.
I like that. That could work. Do you want to take on a parameter section 2 and kind of lay out what that might look like for definitions there? And we can look to see if it misses some edge cases. Environment variable makes sense. Sometimes it's a little more difficult if you have like an image tag.
I don't know. Like, do you have an example of where parameter is something different than an environment variable?
Not in this one. There are other frameworks that have that. Oh, that's fine. So one of the complicated ones is this section here that optionally deploys an instance object when a parameter is set or not.
Yeah, but I mean, if this value is updated, is a parameter, then I would say that you could say that you could force this deploy on cluster to be set as an environment variable just above, and have a default value, which can be true or false, you know. And then if someone is updating the environment variable parameters, then automatically it replay that. No, I don't know. I don't know if it's easy or.
Yeah, let's. I mean,
Because,
we're
you know,
still in the experimental phase. So definitely, let's try out some parameters and see how they would work.
Because it goes to the same discussion we had before, which is like when I update my instance, you know, what do I want to do? You know, sometimes if it's like I change one parameter, it will have an impact that will be different if I change something else. And so you want to have some kind of triggers depending on the parameter you want to update. And that's why I think it's the only way you can really do that is, in my opinion, that we should really have this, you know, this Kafka example or like an example or even the MySQL, because it's probably simpler. But let's say with the spec that you have just defined, how it would look like if I want to deploy, how it would look like if I want to modify this value, how it would look like if I want to, you know, to like, I don't know, like add more nodes or, you know, whatever, like that will probably allow us to find some limitations, because you will try to do something and you will say, oh no, it's not, I cannot do it, or I can, but it's too complicated.
Right. Yeah. So I think one that might be nice that I'm reminded of here is an optional sidecar or init container that runs. And for MySQL, we might optionally add Prometheus MySQL exporter. And I think that might be a good thing to say, like, could we customize our MySQL deployment to add metrics with a parameter? So that maybe I'll kind of put that down as a to-do.
I mean, having like having a complex or having the ability to provide like a real new spec or whatever has probably some value, but I would say it should not be the default, and it should not be like complicated like that for any different parameter you want to set, because, you know, at the end what people will see is these parameters, because people who will use the framework, they will not really know how they have been built, and they will just provide the parameter file. So if the parameter file is not readable or it looks complicated, then they will say, oh my god, like how can I really use KUDO, you know?
Right. Yeah. You know, we definitely want usability to be there, both from the framework developer side and from the application operator. We'll think of some others and kind of go through and see what it would look like to actually.
And don't hesitate if you want to ping me on Slack tomorrow or whenever, you know, if you have a kind of a draft and you want to sit.
Yep, that's good. Yeah, I'll be on. Hope, depends on how the family goes in terms of their sickness. We'll see. Okay, and then the other two are very similar. They update environment variables. Both in the backup file is an environment variable in the job object. So we just need to update it in that one job. And then it gets applied in the backup and restore action. So it's straightforward there. But again, that's currently only an environment variable, but we should look at some other non-standard ones. Okay, so I talked for the whole meeting. Great.
Yeah, you were the secret host. Yeah, and looking at time, it's now 10:40 Pacific time, so we have 5 more minutes for an open discussion or to wrap this up. Also to find a host for the next meeting. So I would say if there are no more questions with dynamic-crds, we move on to the next agenda point and closing. Good. All right. Let's just start with who wants to be the host for the next meeting. Should we maybe give Jared the chance to host it the next week? I know we wanted to also change times for European people. I don't know if we should do that or if we should like postpone it for 1 more week. I would vote for postponing it for 1 more week. But we have a European person on the call, so really that's just my opinion. Just say like same wavelength as of today for the next meeting, and then we can make a decision there with Jared and hopefully also Jörg.
Yep.
Okay.
We should call it a redemption opportunity more than anything, I think.
Absolutely. Oh yes. Oh yes. And I mean, there were valid questions already throughout the meeting, so I don't think we have more questions to ask as of right now. I know we had a fly on the wall, Gaston. So if Gaston also doesn't have more questions, then I would say thank you so much for everyone. And I'll update the meeting notes in the community document. And I also upload the recording of this one, which was very helpful to understand even more and more dynamics of these. Okay, let's cross the finger that the switch to Go modules go smooth. And then we see you next week at the same time, 10 a.m. PT, 1 p.m. ET, and 5 p.m. UTC. Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.